And next we have Andrew Nash from Confyrm.
Right. So, shared signals. What is it? Well, I guess I don't have a roving mic, so I better stay in front. I'll try to be good, which almost everybody here knows is almost impossible. Let's take a look. We've been at shared signals now for about 2 years in various parts of the world, trying to pull together a set of concepts related to some fairly fundamental problems in the identity ecosystem. We do lots of good work at a protocol level on a pairwise set of interactions between participants, IDP to relying party, RP to attribute provider, or a bunch of those sorts of things. The real question is, that we're trying to address is, there are a set of things that are going on in the identity ecosystem that are actually not pairwise problems. So if I actually have an OpenID Connect session outstanding to a mobile device, and I change my password at an IDP that's associated with that, how do you actually let the applications know that the sessions ought to be torn down and re-established? The short answer is we don't have any way to do that. So a whole kind of set of issues related to the operational issues associated with how do you run an identity ecosystem are some of the things we wanted to poke at in the context of this kind of discussion. Apparently, can you guys restart that? Oh, the side one's got it. Thanks. All right, so let's take a look at a practical example. This was actually turned up in my email inbox. So what we have here is an email provider, and the email provider is letting me know that the email I'm looking at is probably a mugged in London or mugged in Singapore or mugged in wherever kind of email. So my email provider has already worked out, running their own risk analysis, that there is something suspect about the email content that I'm looking at. They're good enough to tell me. Part of the challenge here, though, is that in this particular case, I can't remember if this came from Yahoo or somewhere, the information that Google has, for example, about the fact that there's a problem with this email doesn't get propagated back to the account manager of the user whose account's been taken over. So they're protecting me, but there's a set of information here that could have been shared that might have allowed the individual whose account was taken over to use this, that individual could have actually been protected much earlier if we'd actually given some kind of a heads up to say, there's a problem here, why don't you go take a look and see if this really is the person you think you're dealing with. Gizmodo, only a week or so ago, published an interesting article on how much is your email inbox worth to the bad guys. Put that up for you guys to take a look at leisure, but interesting example in this sort of space. Okay, for some reason this wasn't the order that I expected, but we'll work with this. So let's skip over to why do we need signals? Well, as I said, the ecosystem right at the moment has an amazing and growing set of entities that are within the ecosystem as a whole. It used to be, 8-10 years ago, we'd talk about the two-party model, IDPs to RPs. We're up to at least 6 entities that are interesting at this point, and we're starting to share identities and ever more interesting and different combinations. So bad guys obviously like to get a hold of our identities. One of the challenges is that the sharing of that information between those various entities may potentially leave us exposed. So let's take a look at an example. One of the most common mechanisms that any of you have been engaged with as part of the management of your account is the password reset. Come along, you've suddenly realized that your account's no longer accessible under some set of conditions, so you hit the password reset link, a mail message turns up, and that mail message has in there a URL you click on, takes you back to the password reset page. 98% of cases, the fact that you actually re-engaged using that URL within a reasonable temporal time period, and the fact that you are actually interacting on the basis of a well-known event, everybody says, hey, you're actually you, back to do a password reset, and away we go. The problem here is I'm actually making use of a trusted communication channel, which is the email address. If that's been subverted, we're about to lose an account. And this is actually one of the most common ways that we actually see our account subverted, which is the password reset model. One of the biggest challenges we had at Google actually was the problem of how do you actually successfully get users back in control of their accounts, knowing that this is actually the place that bad guys are most commonly going to try to attack. So if I've got a bad guy that's actually in charge of my email account, then my Bank of America account is now potentially exposed. So would it be useful if my email provider could say, heads up, Bank of America, we think that this particular email address may be suspect at this point. And that's the essence of signals. There's actually not much more complex than that. They are fairly constrained in a lot of ways because we actually wanted to try to solve some problems as directly as we could without getting ourselves bogged down into massive sets of complexity. So, for example, we're primarily concerned about operational events. We care about things like, did a password reset occur? We care about things like, has your email account been recycled? How many of you know that your email providers, or at least some of them, actually give away your email addresses if you haven't turned up for a while? Really, really common way of actually getting access to your other accounts. The other part of this is, in addition to them being operational events, they are probably some kind of indicator of potential fraud that's actually taken place. In order to try to keep down the set of concerns that might actually turn up in this space, and no matter how frequently we reiterate these principles, I can pretty much guarantee the set of questions that are going to come up after the last 2 years, the real-world user in our particular model is not in scope. We don't care who you are as a real-world person. We deal with account references, not who you are. In our model, architecturally, the account manager, the relying party, or the identity provider, or whoever, is actually the manager of the relationship, may know who you are as a real-world person, or may not. It's kind of up to the model you're dealing with. We don't care, we don't know, we don't ever want to know. We actually avoid, at all costs, any kind of PII associated with you. And so we've actually come up with a really simple set of models related to the way that an event and then a signal can be propagated in ways that allow you to share information without having to know that you actually are a particular real-world individual. Signals are indicative. We expect they feed a fraud risk engine, and they are simply one of the evaluation points that you will take into account, and so they're not prescriptive. We don't say, hey, we think that an account's been taken over, you should shut down something. We simply say, look, it looks as though there may be a risky kind of event that's occurred somewhere. Here's what we may know a little bit about. And by the way, you should probably pay attention to what happens next. So if a password reset's about to come through, maybe you want to ask for a little extra information in this case, for example. The kind of events that we deal with are actually account-level events, not session-level. We don't know about where you go, we don't care about your sessions, we don't know when you logged in. What we do know about is something operationally occurred related to your account, and that might be important to the set of dependent participants who are also in the identity ecosystem who are playing with you. To take care of some of, hopefully, the remaining issues associated with this, we were very aggressive in terms of data minimization. There's almost no content whatsoever in events and signals, and we actually obfuscate not only the account references that we deal with, but also the publisher of events, because it turns out there are brand issues associated with letting potentially other players know that you may have had 50 million account takeovers today, for example. So we have this brokerage, for want of a better term, this entity known as a signaler manager. For all intents and purposes, it's just an event router. We take in a set of events from known authorities that deal with your account. This is not a scored reference. This is an authoritative statement of something that's occurred. We run them through a bunch of policies, and we'll take a look at a couple of those a little bit later if we get time. And then we generate what we hope are a set of meaningful signals that have high value associated with the collection of individuals that are dealing with this. So there is a simple entity called a signal manager. We've had a prototype of this running for a little over a year, and this is the basis of what we're using for the pilot that we're engaged with for NSTIC. We have probably at the moment about 20 use cases that we've uncovered in various spaces, and we think that there are some interesting and specific domains of use that make sense. It's pretty clear that in the world of internet consumer services that there's some opportunities. It turns out in the context of dealing with identity providers, particularly if they're high assurance identity providers, there are events that occur, for example, at registration time, where it may be useful to know that if your account has been subverted at one identity provider and another one is about to run through a registration event and the same information's in use, that may indicate that you're in the process of helping somebody perpetrate an identity theft, for example. So there are a whole range of these, not enough time to run through any of them. I'm happy to talk to all of them in various forms. It's pretty clear that federations are an interesting case in point here. What we've discovered with a lot of federations is that while the various rules of engagement work pretty well for setting up and understanding what you're supposed to do when you play in that space, the question of how do you ensure that federations run in a trusted fashion is actually one of the very great untapped questions that we haven't dealt with yet. In fact, NIST, for example, published a paper about a year ago, and is actually the topic of that paper where they identified that federation operation is kind of a major place that we need to do some work on. Turns out that in the context of SaaS, there are also a set of different but also interesting use cases. And we're kicking off initially in the pilot with both Ping Identity as a relying party and infrastructure provider, and ID.me as an identity provider. There are a bunch of other folks that we're talking to at the moment, most of whom would like to keep their participation somewhat veiled until we actually manage to work out what the use cases are going to look like. This is all pretty new stuff, as it turns out. Although it's a relatively simple concept, it's various legal groups are wrapping their head around what on earth does it mean to play. So I'm going to look at a couple of use cases just to give you an indication. This is the one that we saw earlier. So here I have an email provider. It's been taken over by the bad guy. Service provider at the other end is about to get a password reset operation. And then what happens at some point, hopefully, is the email provider's risk analysis engines, which are actually pretty impressive. I can let you know from personal experience. Actually run, and at some point somebody says, hey, we think that an event's occurred here that anyone that depends on our identities ought to know about. In this case, it could be an account takeover. Signal manager runs that through a set of policies and says, hey, here are the set of folks that reasonably ought to know about that, and then distributes it. In the case of that particular risky event notification, I've included a data flow here just to give you a sense of how much information gets passed. First thing is, we don't ever actually tell anybody stuff they don't already know, other than the event itself. So, for example, we do not inform service providers of an email address that they don't already know something about. We basically strictly limit the set of information to stuff that you already know about. And so when we go back to say to a service provider, hey, an event's occurred that's associated with this account, we're simply saying the account that you already know about, that you already have control over, there is an issue associated with the communications path that you already told us about. So we're not actually sharing any additional information here. We're simply saying an event's occurred that may change the perception you have of how you ought to interact with that system. And so literally, in this particular case, there are 3 pieces of information shared in the data flow that actually goes over here. There's the event, there's the indication of the target account, and on the incoming side, there's the indication of the account it arrives from, but that never actually gets propagated to anyone else. Account recycling, this is the case where I am at an identity provider and my account is reused. The reason this happens, as it turns out, and does happen at several of the major email providers, is that namespaces are actually very small. Once you're up dealing in the hundreds of millions of identities, And anybody who thinks that they know how to run an identity system and you're only playing with tens of thousands of users might point out that the guys that are running hundreds of millions actually have a pretty effective way of doing it, irrespective of what you might like about their particular policies in various ways. Their problem is, at some point, they actually find that an email address that's been used previously, no one has logged in there for several years. At which point they say, I could really do with that email address. Somebody, as a new user that's coming in, has requested it, and they will give it away. It would be nice if the email provider could say, hey guys, you remember that email address? Belonged to Joe Blogs, still belongs to Joe Blogs, but it's a different Joe Blogs this time around. That would be a really, really useful kind of indicator. So again, that would be a signal. It would be an account recycled event that runs through the signal manager, process and policy, and then distribute to the service providers that have already indicated that they are dependent on that email address. In this case, hopefully we've prevented somebody from being in control of your financial account. And then just as a final one, to give you a sense of what's interesting in some of these cases to relying parties, one of the most common attacks that we experienced at places like PayPal is that if you find that a new account is being set up, there is a non-trivial chance that the email address that's associated with that is going to be used to propagate a fraud if the email address is really, really young. So one of the mechanisms we set up here is an identity oracle where we have the opportunity of saying, hey, I'm registering for an account, maybe at a financial institution. We allow a query interface which says, hey, here's this email address that I have been given permission by my user to query on. Could you tell me if it is less than, and name your favorite amount, 3 hours old, 3 days old, or whatever. If you get back a positive acknowledgement, do you shut down the account? No, it might be perfectly reasonable. But it also might be an indication that you're about to see some pretty interesting fraud occur over the next month or two. And so this is a way to actually try to deal with some of those issues. Bounce is really bad. Policy mechanisms. Just to give you a flavor of some of the sorts of things that we're including in the policy processing, there are policies that can be defined either for a signal recipient, that is the collection of people that receive the processed events, or the event publishers. The reason we use that terminology specifically is, it turns out that if you're an IDP or an RP or an attribute provider, you could fill any of those roles. Depending on your particular policies and your engagement, you could be either an event publisher saying, hey, I know something about the account that I'm dealing with and I want to propagate that, or you could simply be a recipient that wants to receive that information and process it through your risk engine. So in the case of signal recipient policies, they're able to say stuff like, we would like to receive events from a class of event publishers, which includes high assurance identity providers, for example. If you get information from social networks, we're okay with you not telling us about that stuff. We may be a little prejudiced about how we feel about that, but that's kind of the way it is. So you get to specify events that are published by certain classes of event publishers. And then on the other side, the event publisher gets to say, there are certain types of signal recipients that we would like to be able to send this class of events to. Excuse me. Why? Well, it turns out that if you're email providers, you know how each other's business runs. It may be that you're okay with sharing a broader class of events with other email providers than you might be with commercial service providers, for example. So we think that ultimately we're going to see a bunch of subsetting, some kind of closed user group kind of context, and the agreements that actually control who participates in those, what the responsibilities are, etc., is all part of the trust framework that's being established, which describes the rules and the engagement that participants have to play by if they're going to participate in this system. All right, so what are we producing? Well, the first thing we're doing is producing a higher availability and much more ruggedized version of the event clearinghouse that we've had running for the last year or so. We are looking at multiple operational deployments with various entities that fill both the event publisher and the signal recipient role. We are rolling out a trust framework, which is going to describe an open set of definitions around the legal, privacy, and policy definitions so that they can be inspected and understood, and that they can be utilised in a common way. We don't expect that we'll be the only signal processor in this kind of space, but we would like to try to set up a set of agreed approaches that allow other folks that step into this space to also play in an open and consistent kind of fashion. Right at the moment, for those of you who are not aware, the big email providers are actually considering how they might pass around information between each other in the form of signals. We are participating in that group. One of our opportunities in that space is to ensure that we don't have just a bunch of backroom deals that are done, but that we actually engage folks in a set of open standards and policies which are observable and can be described and engaged with by the broader community. I'm sure they'll do a good job on their own, but we'd like to help them with that. Standard participant agreements, one of the values of being a broker in this space is instead of having to set up a set of bilateral agreements between every event publisher and signal recipient, we hope to have standardised ones that refer back to the trust framework and also describe the expected set of roles and responsibilities that you actually have to fill. For example, one of the requirements is going to be that you will not be able to interact with an email address that you don't actually have direct management control over in some form, so it's either the email address that you own as a provider or an email address that your user is identifying as the communication path you have to use. You have to have some kind of formal ownership or relationship, and part of the agreement is going to be that users need to participate in an open set of agreements that actually indicate that information will be shared. Standard set of APIs, these are available now if anybody's interested in taking a look at what's there. They're really simple. They're REST APIs with some fairly simple JSON structures. The reason is that we are trying not to boil the ocean. Instead of trying to come up with a generalized set of security information that could encompass every single possible event that you will ever come across, we are limiting ourselves to operational identity events. Apart from anything else, we believe that way we can actually get some traction, prove the stuff will work, and then think about what the next part of the problem is we want to solve. We have defined event message sets. They very clearly define the kind of events that are possible, and there are a set of policy definitions, a little more detail on the kind of stuff that we've already looked at up to date. But we are expecting to put all of this out into the public domain so that it can not only be debated, understood, agreed on, hopefully, but also it's available for other folks to be able to use as part of this process. Let me close with one comment. I've been playing in the identity space, as most of you know, for about 30 years now. I have deployed public key infrastructure systems from very early days. I was involved in information cards. I've been involved with the OpenID Connect and OpenID mechanisms. Vast numbers of things I was involved in. I was at the first meeting of the Liberty Alliance to produce SAML. I've been pretty much around the block. I love technology. I'm very engaged with it. I'm looking forward to it finally, eventually replacing passwords, as we all are. It's not happening tomorrow. Most of the mechanisms we have in place will take another 10 years to be effective in terms of large-scale deployment. I can help fix the password problems that we have based on attacks, not stupidity, but based on attacks. I can actually make a difference in those tomorrow without having to wait for the general acceptance of large amounts of those technologies. That's why this project's worth doing, I think. Looking forward to your questions later.